had a good chat just before we came on stage, and I'm going to kick it off with a question about how you got started in GitHub and Chatterbug. How did you come up with the thought that, hey, I should go found a company?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I ever did. I was an open source developer. I was a product guy, and I really loved building things. And I got into Git at some point where we were using it in this really esoteric way, and I got to learn sort of how it worked internally, and it opened up my eyes on this technology. And so I spent a lot of time trying to explain it to other people. So I wrote some online resources, and I ended up writing 3 books on it over time. But I got really interested in this and interested in sharing it with people and showing people how it made my life better and it might make their lives better as developers. And through that, I met these guys at this Ruby meetup, conferences like this or meetups or places where you can go and meet other people that are interested in the same things have always been the way of sort of opening up my world to new things. And so I met them, and they wanted to build this thing based on Git, and I was kind of known as the Git freak sort of in this community. And so they wanted me to help them, with how this actually worked. And so that's how I got involved in them. And then it was just 4 guys kind of doing this side project that started making a little bit of money, and we get some sort of beer with the money that was coming in, on the weekend or whatever. And then it got big enough for us to kind of quit our jobs, and it sort of snowballed into this global phenomenon, right, where we had essentially the entire open source community on our platform. But it was never something that we went into to make money. It was never something we went into to be successful. It was always this sort of project of love. And Chatterbug was very similar, right, where I was living in Paris for a year as part of my time at GitHub, trying to sort of dog food the remote employee experience and really live that life. And so I was in Paris for a year, and I was trying to learn French at the time, and just failing. It was so much harder than I thought. There's so much snake oil out there. There's so much, learn French in 5 minutes a day that does not work. And so I went through it really hard, and I figured out what does work, and then I built a product based on all of the things I wanted to have paid money for, right? And so that's kind of how I got into both of those.
So it's interesting because in both of those situations, Scott was actually the customer. And I think one thing that's really interesting to hear about is how customer centricity was at the heart of both GitHub and Chatterbug. And how do you actually live that? Lots of people talk about customer centricity, but how do you live that?
Yeah, so I mean, at GitHub it was fairly easy because almost all of our employees, for the first 100 employees or something, were engineers, and most of them were open source open source developers. And so, if you're building an open source, hosting platform, and you hire all these open source developers to work on it, then they tend to build things that they want to see for their own projects, right? And so it was relatively easy. And then even at GitHub, when we expanded, we would make everybody in the company use GitHub for whatever we could get them to do. So like our lawyers used GitHub to put sort of IP assignment rules on it, or agreements in Markdown on GitHub, and then employees could go in and send pull requests against the IP assignment stuff and say, like, I'd be more comfortable if this clause wasn't in there or something. And so everybody in the company was using GitHub for anything that we could do. In fact, I don't know how many of you are lawyers or work with lawyers. Probably everybody works with lawyers. If lawyers used GitHub, it would be a massively better world, because like no emailing goddamn, red line Word documents back and forth and figuring out who did what. And like if it's just in Markdown and you send a pull request and say, I want to change this line to this, and you're like, okay, accept the pull request. Oh my God. And so I lived the dream in GitHub, but I have not since then. It's been a nightmare ever since. But and at Chatterbug, it's sort of the same thing, right? Everybody in the company, one of the corporate perks, but really it's something we really want people to do from a corporate perspective, is to learn a new language all the time. So everybody in the company has to be learning a new language. It's part of your sort of review, right? When you're checking in with your manager, how are you doing on what language are you learning? What's your new goal? Because we want people to always be feeling the pressure and feeling the pain of what it is to learn a language, and what they like and what they don't like, whether they use our internal platform or if it's a language that we don't offer yet, some external thing, and we can learn from what other people do, what are nice in other systems. But always using I learned German from 0 to B2, if you know sort of European language standards. but it's sort of upper intermediate, lower advanced level. So I'm relatively fluent in German at this point, but I did it all through our system, right? It's incredibly important to me that I understand also as a CEO what it's like to learn a language all the time, right? And so when I'm kind of done with this, with C-level German, then I'll move on to something else, Italian or Mandarin or Japanese or something. But I think it's really important to, as much as possible, use your own product, but have everybody in the company use your own product.
Interesting. We have a couple of marketing technology companies in our portfolio, and I was telling Scott that the developers and the product folks always bristle when the marketing team at those companies give them feedback on their own product. They don't look at it as a positive, but it sounds like that's a really critical piece for you.
Yeah, always.
Interesting. So you picked two markets that were not nascent markets, right? They were well known,
right.
And there were lots of other solutions in those spaces. But yet you felt compelled to create companies to do something better. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, I think the most interesting type of startup for me is something that's not in a space that doesn't exist at all, right? Like I'm not interested in Bitcoin. I'm not interested in I mean, sorry if you're into Bitcoin here, but that's not something that's interesting to me. What's interesting to me is large markets that are poorly served, right? And markets where there are a lot of solutions, but most of the solutions are not looking at the customer, right? What the customer is actually, whether they're actually successful, whether they actually like to use the product or not. But you know, most of them, especially in the large ones, they're just looking at how can we sell this? How can we get people to use it? How can we get people to buy it? But they don't really care, is it easy to use? Is it helping them do their job? Is it helping them do what it's meant to do? Do they love it, right? I want my customers to love the product. And so GitHub was the same thing. There were a ton, there was SourceForge, there was RubyForge, there were all these places you could share open source code. There were also a lot of corporate client or corporate customers or providers like ClearCase or Rational Rose or Perforce or something, right? They're all competitors sort of to what GitHub became, but nobody liked using any of those products. And so, coming from a customer standpoint and saying we can make something, even though there's a million competitors, but we can make something that people actually like to use and focus on that rather than focus on how can we get enough eyeballs to do advertising on this website, or how can we gather demographics that are not actually needed for the user but we need for advertising, whatever, and just makes the whole experience really poor. We didn't care about any of that. It was only what was the customer experience. And Chatterbug's the same thing, right? Like I'm not really interested in how many users can we get onto the platform and how much hypergrowth can we do or how can we sell this. I'm interested in, can people learn a language for real, right? And so even at Chatterbug, we have people go through as fast as sort of they can to take as many classes a day as they can, and then when they hit certain levels, we have them go and take Gotha courses or examinations so that we can know, are we as effective as going to an in-person language school, right? Because we want to make sure that if we're issuing like a certificate, like a B1 certification or B2 certification, that means that you can actually go and take that certification at Gotha Institute, or you can take that certification at Alliance Française, right? Like we want to make sure that people are really, really learning it in the same way that they would be doing anywhere else. And I think there's no other language learning company on the market that gives a shit about that, right? That actually cares that if you go through Duolingo or whatever, like you can speak, that's not a goal of theirs, right? And so it's very important to me, and it's very interesting to me to go into large markets that are poorly served and say, how can we actually build something for the customer that's valuable?
Well, we are here at Venture Atlanta, and some of these companies are looking to raise capital. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about your experiences raising capital. You talk about the fact that when you raised capital at GitHub, you didn't have to. In fact, you probably would be drinking an awful lot of beer if you had to drink all of your profits by the time you raised capital. So tell us why you were interested in bringing in a partner and how that helped you.
Yeah, so I mean, GitHub was bootstrapped, and we got, again, like we quit our jobs when we were making enough money and started making really crappy salaries, and then gave ourselves a raise every month until we got up to like more of a normal salary. And so our revenues just grew, and then we grew along with whatever the revenue was. And so we never actually needed VC. What we did actually for both because at Chatterbug we didn't need VC either, because Tom and I had this Microsoft exit, and we can put money into the company and grow it and make it be what we want it to be. But we have raised in both of them, and mostly it was for advice, right? It was to bring in something to the company that it was difficult for us to figure out. Otherwise, I think in my experience, VCs have seen 100 companies. They know tons of CEOs. They know tons of people that they can connect me to talk to about specific problems. So if I have problems with IBAN fraud in Europe, or I want to figure out how do I do it, how do I incorporate a GmbH and move part of the company and expand into Berlin, I think it's very difficult to find that experience otherwise. And so VCs, I think, have been, for me, that's why we've connected. So they have some stake in the game, and then I can ask them whatever I need. And it was the same with Andreessen Horowitz. We took money from them not because we needed to, but and we chose Andreessen Horowitz specifically because they had this sort of lineup of people. Right at the time, that was relatively rare as well, of having all of these operators that all of the portfolio companies could ask for advice or could ask for guidance. And they had that, and the other companies were essentially just offering money. And what was interesting to us, being 4 product guys that started this company that's just going like wildfire, not having any business background and not having ever done a business before, is how do we do marketing? How do we do, what is the state of the art in any of these things? How do we hire a CMO or a head of sales? And we had no idea how to do any of that. And so we connected to them for experience more than for cash.
And so how do you bring experience into a company when you have 4 founders who are developers and who have probably done things a certain way for a period of time till you get to a size where you feel like, maybe I do need to bring in some professional business help? Yeah. So I mean, at GitHub, it took a really long time. We tried. The head of sales was the most difficult because we had so many developers and open source developers, and they were kind of hippie, right? Like they were like, fuck sales, and like they didn't really, they were always kind of the coin-driven operator, aggressive types that was what was from their background that they really didn't want to work with, pushing them to write features that they didn't want to write and things like that. And so everybody had this bias that was really strong against sales, especially outgoing sales, outside sales. And so it took us a really long time to find somebody that was kind of, copacetic with how GitHub operated and understood it and could sell it in a way that was better than even the way that the developers could sell it, right? Like sell this vision, and we found this guy Paul St. John that was our head of sales. That was fantastic, and I think really helped. Without finding him specifically, it would have been very, very difficult to do that. But it was very difficult to find that. It took us at least a year of looking for people and trying out people, and we finally found somebody. But it was this very specific type that was very difficult to find. And in Chatterbug, I actually started with hiring a COO, right? And so, or hiring a business person to say, look, we don't really know how to do a lot of this stuff, and so we want somebody in the team early on saying, okay, I've built a business before, they have a business degree, they understand how to do this, so that when we're not making those mistakes from the get-go and trying to backfill that in later. Sorry. So it sounds like one of the difficulties in hiring management was just the culture and the cultural fit. And I've read in a number of places you talk about the culture of first principles. Maybe you can share with the group what that meant to you personally and GitHub, and how you've kind of lived that ever since.
Yeah, so that was sort of the guiding philosophy, I think, or framework of GitHub, was we would constantly talk about first principles. And first principles is sort of this idea from physics, right, of you're going so far down a problem and it's just unsolvable, and so you go back to first principles. What are we really trying to solve? What are the basic things that we actually know? And start from there over again and just forget about what we had worked on before. And the easiest way to demonstrate it is there's this thing of the 5 whys. I don't know if anybody's ever done that, but you have a problem set and you're like, I'm gonna, or I mean, we can do it from a physics standpoint, but from a product standpoint, we want a issue tracker, right? And it's why? Because people want to be able to figure out what they're going to do next. Why, right? And you just keep going down that like a 5-year-old would, which if you have children, maybe you find that incredibly annoying. But it's interesting from a business standpoint to just keep asking, like, what are we really actually trying to do here? So I was telling you, I think earlier, about like we would do it in HR, we would do it in product, we would do it almost anywhere in the company, of what are we trying to solve with this thing. So like vacation days, right? We did unlimited vacation days for a while because we were trying to say, like, what is the point of limiting vacation days? If people are burnt out, do we really want to, or sick or something, do we really want to say, no, come into work? Is that actually helpful for us? Like, why are we doing this? What is the point of providing vacation days to employees? And then later on, that actually turned to, if we had unlimited vacation days and we weren't tracking them, then people weren't taking them, right? And so the point of vacation is to get people to relax, or to get people to not come in when they're actually sick and make other people sick. And so we wanted to make sure that people were using that, and by just saying, okay, we're not going to track vacation days, that didn't actually solve the problem. And so we would constantly be asking, for this specific thing, what is the point of this thing, and how can we actually make that work the best in the company, no matter whether it's what somebody else has done or not, right? We're trying to figure out the core of what is the point of this thing and how can we solve that the best.
So I think your kids are younger than mine, because as the mother of teenage girls, I think it's me asking them the 5 whys, not them asking me.
Why Snapchat?
Exactly. When we spoke earlier, you talked a little bit about building teams and how it's really hard to keep that culture and find the right people, and especially find people that look like your customers, and that it was really critical for you, both at GitHub and Chatterbug, to hire people that look like your customers, and that inherently means diversity. So talk a little bit about why that's so important to you and how you've gone about doing that.
Yeah, so I mean, at GitHub, we started as these young male software developers in San Francisco, and most of our first customers were young male software developers in San Francisco. And as we went into the Ruby world, we got more young male software developers throughout more of the rest of the world. And so that was the customer base, and that was what we were hiring from. And that was fine for a while, that worked for a while, but as we expanded into other software development languages where people had been doing it longer, where it was more Java, where it was more corporate, where there were people of different ages and men and women and everything, especially into other countries, right? We'd go into other countries and people were doing business differently, people were doing open source differently, and it just became difficult because I think the demographics of the company did not change in the way that the demographics of our community changed. And as we grew, that became really problematic, right? Of just not understanding why can't people pay for stuff with credit cards in China, or why, like payment methodologies, or just the idea of sharing code, right? Or like, how do we sell open source in these other cultures? They're all very different. And so having people, I think, from all of these different cultures and all these different backgrounds of where our customers came from within GitHub would have been very, very valuable, and it was something that was very difficult for us to do. We were more internally focused. And just hiring people that you knew and people that were in your spheres became really sort of insular after a while, right? And it was more difficult to kind of break out of that. And hiring mostly software developers and like nobody else in the company, no marketing, we had customer service and engineering. That was 90% of the company. I think it made it difficult to expand out and to understand different points of view. In Chatterbug, it's exactly the opposite, right? We're building a language learning company, and we're hiring educators to build out our curriculum and to own all of our own curriculum. And so that means hiring people from different backgrounds, people that speak multiple languages, people that grew up in different countries from all over the world. It's also whatever problems you have, if you're trying to grow an engineering team, whatever problems you have with the sort of gender diversity of your engineering team, if you're trying to hire educators, is exactly the opposite, right? So we have 90% women on that team, and then on the engineering team, it's easier, I think, for us to expand the gender diversity of the engineering team than the education team, because the pools are exactly the opposite, right? But yeah, so now, I'm now in the company at Chatterbug. I think it's probably 3/4 women, because we have the education team is so strong in the company. But I think it really does more accurately reflect the customer base that we have in a really positive way.
So if we go back to the early days of GitHub, it was a free solution, and you went from free to fee, which is often a really challenging thing to do. And I don't know how many of the folks out in the audience are facing that dilemma, but but it's not as easy as just flipping a switch.
Right.
Can you walk the group through how you made that transition and maybe some of the lessons learned in the process?
Yeah, I mean, with GitHub, it was actually relatively easy because we had an open source hosting solution that we thought was much better than what was out there. It was really, we were open source developers. We liked putting our own stuff on it. It was a side project, and we started inviting our friends and stuff and people within our communities into this platform, so that they could share their open source stuff, mostly Ruby developers. And at some point, one of our customers, our friends, Jeffrey Grossenbach, I think was the first person to do this, said, I want to use this for my private code as well. Like, I just want to put my company's code on here, because he had a little sort of a small publishing company. I want to put all my tooling and stuff on here and just work on it there. Can I pay you if it's private, right? And we were like, that'd be great. We can absolutely do that. And then sat down to write the billing code that night so that he could give us the credit card the next Monday. And anecdotally, the guy who wrote the billing code, PJ, was known as our CFO from that point forward, because he's the guy who wrote the billing code. And so we started taking money that way. So it was actually requests from our customers, right? We want to be able to pay you, which if you can build something where your customers are like, we want to pay you for this, then that's the best possible type of company to build. So yeah, I mean, it grew organically. It was just something that came to us of I liked this product enough. I want to pay you for a different feature, or in this case, actually the removal of a feature, which was that it was available to everybody, and that was the model sort of from that point forward.
And at Chatterbug, has it started for a fee?
Yeah, no, it always started for a fee, because the idea of, well, I mean, we were trying to work toward, we were doing the opposite. We wanted to go from fee to free, where one of the things we'd really like to do at some point is to allow, because the point of Chatterbug is that there are tutors in this network, right? You do self-study like you do on Duolingo or something, but then you get to a point, and then we want to connect you with a native speaker and have you go through exercises with a native speaker, and that you constantly have access to a native speaker one-on-one, and that's the real way to learn a language, right? Is to constantly practice the language with a speaker that's a native speaker of that. And we wanted to do it so that the native speaker didn't have to have pedagogical training, that we could build that into the software, and that if you speak English, you can be a teacher of English, right? And we can kind of unlock this potential that everyone in this room could teach English on Chatterbug, right, if they're a native English speaker, because you have a ton of information and knowledge that's very specific, that's very valuable to people. There's lots of people who want to learn English, and vice versa. And so what we wanted to do is get to the point where we have such a large network that we can get people swapping time, right? And I can teach English and I can learn Spanish, and it doesn't cost either of us any money, and there's pedagogy involved, and that we can actually get millions of people to learn this language, or to learn a new language, which is very important to me. But we had to start with a fee so that we knew that people actually liked using it, right? Like, you can use it the opposite way as well, which is if we can build something that people will pay and pay for months for, then we know that we've actually built a relatively good product, because, and especially individuals. We wanted to start with B2B, but it's easier to sell bullshit into businesses than it is to sell bullshit to individuals that are paying with their own money, right? And so that we kind of swapped what our original strategy was, which was to do B2B play, into B2C, so that we could know that it worked well and that people loved using it before we went and sold into businesses.
Interesting. When we were speaking earlier, you gave an example at GitHub and then an example at Chatterbug as well of how focus was actually really critical to your success. I know in our portfolio companies we talk about ideal customer profile and getting people to actually focus their efforts on a narrower market. Talk a little bit about how you used focus and how that helped you build communities, which ultimately led to your success.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the key things that we took out of Chatterbug, like Tom and I, so my co-founder at Chatterbug was also one of the co-founders at GitHub, Tom Preston Warner, and we sat down, I think, when Chatterbug first started and kind of were thinking a lot about what would we bring over, what would we do again, and what would we not, how would we restart. It was an interesting sort of restart period. But one of the things that I think was key for us was to focus on a very specific segment, right? And so when GitHub started, we were Ruby open source hosting, essentially, right? Like, there was almost nothing else on our platform. It was 90% of the code that was on GitHub was Ruby code. We had friends in the Ruby community. We went to every Ruby meetup or conference or Ruby on Rails or whatever, and we knew everybody in the industry that was giving talks at these conferences, and that's how we hired a lot of our first people, and that's just everywhere where we evangelized Git specifically, and GitHub as a secondary product. And so we got the Ruby community to come over to Git before anything else, and they kind of brought JavaScript with them because a lot of their projects were also working on JavaScript, so then they'd bring JavaScript over, and we kind of hit one community after the other. But we didn't come out trying to hit everybody in open source at the same time, right? We focused on one very specific community and tried to make sure this community is very, very happy with us, right, before moving on to anything else. We've hit sort of all their feedback points, that we have thousands of extremely happy customers, that it is really, really working for them before trying to go into other countries or go into other languages. And it's kind of the same with Chatterbug. It's a little bit different because we were trying to get multiple languages out, and so we were marketing all over, but now we're focusing on Germany. Everybody in Germany knows Chatterbug. Everybody in Germany is aware of this brand and knows if you really want to learn a language, you learn it with Chatterbug, and then grow into other countries, right? We're not trying to hit the Americas. We're not trying to hit everywhere else. It's a very German company.
So if you had one do-over at GitHub, what would it be?
If I had one do-over at GitHub, I think it would be to have a management structure in place much, much earlier. I think that caused most of our biggest problems at GitHub, is that we look at the open source community and say, oh, well, open source doesn't need management, and so why should our company need management? We just took everything from how open source projects were run, and we said we're going to build a business that runs this way. And it doesn't, we look at Linux and be like, there's thousands of people here, but thousands of people that are working on Linux, most of them are working on them and are working on it being paid by private companies, right? And so they still have management, they just don't have management within the Linux community structure. And so we kind of didn't see that, right? And we didn't have direct reports, and everybody was coming to the co-founders for everything, and it was just a shit show. Nobody knew how to get promoted, nobody knew what their career path looked like, nobody knew what was expected of them, or if they were failing those expectations, or if they would get fired next week. And it was really, really difficult. And so everything that's good, we were young guys that had only had crappy managers before, and we're like, well, ipso facto, all managers are crappy, and so we're not going to have managers. And it was super, super problematic. And then the way that we tried to solve it is you didn't want to then switch and then bring in some manager to manage this group of people, because they would reject the host. And so what ended up, we would try promoting the best engineers, because you didn't want mid-level engineers to then manage the team. You wanted the best engineers, because then people looked up to them. But the best engineers are almost by far the worst managers, because they don't care about management. They're good at engineering because they like engineering, right? And so that didn't work out very well either. It was a huge nightmare. And so it took a really, really long time of just this slow burn to get to the point where we could solve these problems and have a management structure that worked. And at Chatterbug, the very first thing we did was everybody has a direct report, right? Like when you start at the company, here's the person you report to, and that person they know what they need to do, they know what they need to provide for the employee. What do you want to do in your career? How can we help? Here's what's expected of you. You're not meeting expectations. Do weekly one-on-ones. Like, this is what you should do as a manager. If you don't want to do that, don't accept a direct report, right? And so we've grown the company that way. It's very simple. There's not a ton of overhead this way. I think in the long run, if we had done that at GitHub from the first days, if we had known that, that it would have solved tons and tons of problems.
Interesting. Well, you didn't stick around for the Microsoft exit. Not that you knew that was going to be coming, but you left a couple of years before. Help us understand, why did you leave a growing, successful company to start a new one?
Yeah, I mean, you need to love what you're doing, right? And at that point, Tom, who was of the four co-founders, the one that I most enjoyed working with, both on a personal and professional level, he had left the company, he was gone, he was looking for other things to do, and I really wanted to work with him again. And I think GitHub was getting to the point where, you get this thing running and it's a startup and you never know if it's going to fail or hit a rock or whatever, and you get it to, 450 employees and it's on a path, and it's going to, if you have 450 employees, that means there's 449 people working in the company that are smarter than you at anything that you could do. And so I thought it would be more fun in my life at that point to start something new, to create something new that I wanted to see in the world, and to do it with the guy that I liked working the most with. So actually there was a long period of time where I was pitching Tom ideas. I was still working at GitHub, and I was pitching him ideas, trying to see if he'd bite on any of them. And the language learning one was the one that we did some VR stuff and everything. We even programmed on some of those for a while. But the language learning one was the one where he was interested because he wanted to provide 1 million jobs, right? And so having this platform where, again, everybody in this room could be a native English teacher, like we provided a platform to unlock the talent that you have at this thing that you've been learning your whole life, and help other people, you give that to other people, and maybe have a job doing that. He saw this potential for having millions of jobs that way, and I saw the opposite, which was I wanted to have 1 million people learn a new language, because I look at sort of the problems in the world and the things that frustrate me with xenophobia or with sort of nationalism. And I feel like learning a new language is one of the most potent ways of addressing that, right? If you learn Arabic, if you learn Spanish, if you learn French or German, you're connected to something that is not your world anymore, right? And it opens it up, and it makes you empathize, makes you see different points of view, and I find that that's incredibly valuable. And so we wanted to do this from both of these different sides, and that's why I started something new.
Did you bring people along with you from GitHub? Is the team at Chatterbug?
Yeah, we brought the one engineering manager that was really good. Sorry, everybody else at GitHub that might be watching this. We brought Russell Belfer, and I had worked with him at a previous startup. And we brought Liz Klinkenbeard, who was the head of PR and internal communications at GitHub. And so that was the 4 sort of co-founding. I wanted to have 4 co-founders again. So I kind of waited to start the new company until I got a group of people that I wanted to work with, and I really didn't want to go into it by myself.
Interesting. So you live half of the year in Berlin, half in the U.S. How do you know when it's time to go international as a company?
Yeah. So for us, we wanted to go to market. We were working on this thing. We had this German curriculum. I was going through it. The rest of the company was kind of starting to go through it, and we said, let's go to market as early as possible. Let's go and start selling this. And Germany seemed like the best place, because I knew a bunch of people that were expats in Berlin. There's tons of tech expats in Berlin that had never learned German, and some of them had tried. And so I said, maybe there's a market for this here. And so we're going to open up an office in Berlin. We're going to start hiring. We're going to start selling this product in Berlin and see how it does when it hits the market, right? See what we need to change. Instead of waiting another year or 2 until we have all these languages and then do this big launch, I was like, let's hit the market early. Let's start testing it early. Let's start getting beta customers. I want to see if this works. I want to see if people like using this. And I want to do it early. And so since we had German, we did German because I already knew some French. I already knew some Spanish. It didn't have an alternative character set. It seemed like the next language that I wasn't, Italian was too close to French and Spanish, so I was like, German's different enough, I can do it, I can build this platform, learn German, and then see how it stacks up to how I try to learn French, and it'd be a relatively good comparison. And so we had this German curriculum, and so we moved to Berlin. And it ended up being where we grew every other hire from that point forward, because we would look at Berlin, and office space is very affordable, there's a huge talent pool, the cost of living is very low. It's a big startup community, and there's tons of expats. There's people from all over the world, so building a diverse team is very easy. And we looked at this, and every hire, we were like, we want to hire an engineer, and it's like we could do it in Berlin, or we could do it for 3 times more, money in San Francisco. Right. And we're like, let's just hire 2 engineers in Berlin, right? And so we just ended up hiring everybody in Berlin for all of these different reasons. And actually, it's probably a good plug for this room. My partner and I are starting sort of an incubator accelerator in Berlin to help companies do this. So if your company is interested in expanding into Berlin, or you have a startup that wants to make their runway last twice as long and is interested in moving to Berlin and getting into the European market, please let me know. Because that's mainly what we're trying to help companies do now, right? Either young entrepreneurs in Berlin to grow a business, or American companies that are trying to do what we did, which is move to Berlin and expand in Berlin, because you can get a lot farther and have access to the European market, which is great. There's lots of money in Germany, right? Like if you are selling some product, you have some service or something, it's a fantastic market, and it's very affordable, and there's a huge talent pool there. So.
So does that mean you actually have an HQ? Because I know at GitHub it was a pretty remote organization.
Yeah, so GitHub was 60-40. We had a HQ, and then we had 60% of the company that was remote. And so at that level, everybody's a remote employee, because if that much of your team is remote, then the whole team is remote. And so we operated as essentially a remote company, and then we had this interesting sort of problem set where we would try to get people together, because there are times when you want them physically together, and that means we had to fly people from all over the place and find some house that we could rent for a couple of days and have them get some whiteboards in there and have them do like this mini summit, and then all go back and work on their problem sets again. And then just from an HR perspective, in the headquarters, we had all of the problems of people being physically together. So people would date each other, or people would have cliques, or people would have whatever, and like all of these problems of people being in the same room together, like came out there, but not in the other 60% of the company. But the other 60% of the company would become sort of professionally isolated and want to be around other people, and it's kind of they'd be working in their attic office or whatever all day with their wife and kids and stuff, and it'd be great from a personal perspective. But they just miss being in the office with people, right, occasionally. And so what we ended up at Chatterbug doing is going to more of a hub mentality. So we have San Francisco and Berlin, and we try to hire in those locations, and so that people, or in a location where you can at least get to Berlin within an hour or two, right, on a train or on a plane or something, and so that we can say, hey, next Wednesday we're going to get the whole team together, and that's not a pain in the ass. And that's mostly what we've been trying to do. So it's kind of in between the two. But it operates essentially as a remote company, in that you have all of the perks of a remote company, which is you can work from home whenever you want. You can work from home when you're sick. You can work irregular hours if you need to take your kid to school or something. You can work from the library if you need quiet time or need to be away from people for a while. We have an office if you want to come in. Like I think everything, all of the advantages of remote life, we have a lot of that built into the structure of how we run the company, and we're trying to avoid most of the disadvantages of having a massively dispersed team.
It's interesting. So you've taken a lot of the lessons learned from GitHub and applied them at Chatterbug, which is, it's great to kind of hear that juxtaposition. Looks like we only have a couple minutes left. So my last question is, as you look back on your career to date, what are you most proud of? And as you look forward, what are you most looking forward to doing?
Yeah. I think as I look back, there's two things that I'm most proud of in my career. I think one is the cultures of the companies that I've created. I think I've been instrumental in helping create the cultures in both of these companies, and I think for both of the companies, there are people that it's the best job that they've ever had, or especially because of the remote thing, and my also evangelization and GitHub's evangelization of the remote thing. I think that having people have that flexibility of being able to be good parents, right, and have, like, if their kid has a play that day or whatever, that they can go to the play, and it's not like, no, you need to be at your desk from 8 to 6 or whatever, right, or if they're sick, that they work from home, they don't get other people sick, or if they have family members that need care, right, that they can have the flexibility to do that. I think that having a remote office culture, whether they're all kind of in the same city or not, but having this flexibility of, you just need to do this job, right? I don't really care when you do it or how you do it, just do this job. Having that attitude of both of the companies, I think I'm very proud of that, because I think it's allowed, GitHub especially became an example of that other people could take into their companies and be like, GitHub does this, maybe we can do that. And I like to think that maybe that's rippled out and had people be able to spend more time with their kids or with their family, or have better lives, right? And I'm proud of that. And then the other thing is open source, right? I think that I did a lot of evangelization of Git. Specifically, I almost never talked about GitHub. I was a horrible salesperson. I was the worst salesperson as sort of an executive of all time, because I would never talk about GitHub. I would always go to these conferences and talk about Git, right? Here's the underlying methodology. Use GitHub, don't use GitHub, I don't care, but like, this is better than Subversion. This is a better way of collaborating with people. This is a better way of using your time. And having people use that, I think, has expanded out, writing several books on GitHub, or on Git, and open sourcing them and making sure that they're available, and not really caring about the revenue from the book, but just trying to make sure as many people as possible can read this. I think has made a relatively large impact probably on the open source community as a whole. And the open source community, I think, is good for tons and tons of people, right? It's good for businesses of not reinventing the wheel all the time. It's good for people trying to bootstrap their way into this industry because they can get a name in open source without going to a university or a fancy place. And they can do it for free because of all these online resources. And so I'm really proud of my impact in open source. And I have no idea. I've actually had conversations with people whether GitHub sort of made Git or Git made GitHub, right? And what was bigger. But I think it definitely had an impact in open source, and that I'm very, very proud of. And in the future, like I already told you, what I'm looking forward to is helping millions of people learn languages. Like that's my ultimate goal. That's what I want to do. That's what I think has an outsized impact in the world. In a way that's very difficult to do in other ways, right? I want to help people empathize, and I think language is a fantastic tool for that.
Well, thanks, Scott. I think you'll all join me in agreeing that Scott did a great job today. Thank you.
Thank you.